You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. It's been nearly a week since Hurricane Milton made landfall near Siesta Key and ripped through the Tampa Bay region and across central Florida, just as people were beginning to pick up their lives after Hurricane Helene. And for many of you, it's been a tough stretch, dealing with damage to your homes, flooding, boil water notices and power outages, and the frantic search for gas. Here's Anita Doering, who waited more than 3 hours over the weekend to refuel her SUV.
Let's say it's been the worst experience of my life. If I maintain my sanity after I get gas, I'll be a miracle. The advice I'd give, don't drink anything.
Milton knocked out power to more than 3 million customers statewide. By midday Tuesday, just over 180,000 were still without power, most of them in the Tampa Bay region. Tampa Electric said its goal was to get the power back on for its Hillsborough and Pinellas County customers by end of day Thursday. Here's CEO Archie Collins in a video on TECO's YouTube channel explaining how the company prioritizes the work of getting people reconnected.
Is really an assessment of impact versus effort. We just need to replace one pole or one wire and we can get 2,000 customers up. We'll go there first. If it's a whole lot of work and a whole lot of trucks and it's only 5 customers, unfortunately, that lands a little bit lower in the prioritization list.
Flooding continues to be a problem in parts of the Tampa Bay region, with residents of some Pasco County neighborhoods likely to be battling river flooding through the middle of the week. You can find the latest on hurricane recovery on WUSF.org. Coming up in the next 30 minutes, you're going to hear how election supervisors are working to make sure you can still vote despite the hurricane impacts, and how communities can plan to be more resilient as they rebuild. But first, life is starting to return to some semblance of normal after back-to-back hurricanes, and that includes getting back to school. Manatee and Hernando County schools were back today. Pinellas, Pasco, Sarasota, and Polk County schools were set to reopen Wednesday, and Hillsborough County schools will reopen Thursday. Tampa Bay Times education reporter Jeff Solacek says getting power back on is the first step in reopening schools.
Every school district had different impacts, because if you went to interior parts of Pasco, they had the river flooding as well. And actually the 2 schools there in Pasco that had the longest power outages were way out in Dade City area. And when you go to Pinellas, it's sort of like the middle of the county there too. I was at Pinellas Park High School this morning, Tuesday morning, and they were saying that they just recently got their power on, and the lights near the school that govern traffic, still some of them were not working. And they were working pretty hard there because they had water. Some of the schools took on water. So Pinellas Park High School, for instance, they had been replacing carpeting in certain areas, and they had these big, gigantic tubes that were going through, and they were pumping in air to dehumidify and dry out things. It's really interesting to walk through there and see some of the things that they're trying to accomplish to get the schools ready to be back up and ready to have students back on Wednesday.
For sure. And what about transportation? School buses can sometimes be a little precarious in terms of having enough bus drivers in the best of times. What about now? Are there going to be any issues getting students to and from school if they rely on the bus system?
Well, each district said essentially some version of, we can't guarantee you that we will be on time. They are running their bus routes on Tuesday to make sure what's out there. They're looking to see if there are still some things in the way that might make it so that the route needs to be changed. They're going to let families know about that. And of course, they're saying that we want you to be there safely. So they are going to run buses. They may not be on time, but they will be there. And they also pointed out that if you are not at your ordinary bus stop because you were displaced or something, they will pick you up. They're not just going to say, no, you're not supposed to be on this bus.
There's also a pretty big chunk of educational time that's been taken out of the schedule, and Florida schools obviously build some of this into their preparation throughout the year. But a week off school is going to be a lot to make up. So what are the school districts doing to account for that?
Well, I want to point out that between Helene and then Milton, the school districts around here have lost about 10 days if they open on Wednesday as scheduled. So that means that that's time that they have to make up, because the state has essentially indicated that they will not waive the required instructional minutes, which is measured in minutes. And the reason I say that is because some school districts are talking about maybe picking up a day or two that had been scheduled as a vacation or a day off. But for the most part, they try to add minutes back into their schedule. So you probably might be looking at, say, 10 minutes longer per day for the rest of the school year in order to make up the missed time.
Are there any other things that the schools are looking to do to make sure the students are feeling okay about this, and staff and teachers too?
Well, when I spoke with the principal at Pinellas Park, he said that the most important thing is to make sure that as students return, that they know that they are cared about and that the school loves them. And it was interesting. I was talking to a teacher who was walking into the school, and she told me that her house had been flooded during Helene. She felt grateful that the oak tree next door didn't slam into them during Milton. And she was walking in with a huge smile on her face. She said she loves her school. She's ready to get it back on track, and she can't wait to see the students again. And that seems to be the general demeanor, is that, we're a community and we come together and we're going to do what we can to take care of all your needs, academic and otherwise.
You just heard from Tampa Bay Times education reporter Jeff Solacek. Turning now to voting, Election Day is just weeks away. Mail-in ballots are in hand and early voting is about to start. And if you're a voter in communities affected by hurricanes, Craig Latimer is here to give you some advice. He's the supervisor of elections in Hillsborough County and a former president of the state supervisors organization. Craig, what impact did Milton have on your office, and how about your colleagues across the Tampa Bay region?
Yeah, so been some tremendous impact. I've been in contact with my colleagues in Pinellas, Pasco, Sarasota, and they've had a lot of power outages, things that we've had too. The problem, though, is that the previous storm, Helene, we know really impacted with the surge along those coastal communities too. So that's had a lot of impact. But I'll tell you, we opened it. A lot of other offices aren't open. The schools aren't open, but we've got early voting starts in just 1 week. So it was important for me that we get open. We're staffed. We've got 4 of our 5 offices open. We got the call center going so people can call our office, and we encourage them to do that if they've got any questions. Or the biggest thing is that if they've relocated and they want to get a vote by mail ballot, call our office at 813-744-5900 if you're a Hillsborough County voter, and we will help walk you through the process so that we can get that vote by mail ballot to you.
Mail ballots had to be sent out by October 3rd statewide. What happens if your home was badly damaged by a storm, or if you're in an area that's not receiving mail? What do you do then?
Yeah, so the areas that aren't receiving mail, what the post office is doing is setting up temporary distribution sites. So they may be, giving you your mail out of a big mail truck or something, but you can, find out where that is in your community if that's the case. I know down in South County, they closed down the postal facility in South Shore, but they merged it over with the Sun City Center place there. But, that's the biggest thing. If somebody had ordered a vote by mail ballot and now they're, not in that home anymore, their mailbox isn't standing, call our office. We can send another ballot to a different address. We'll cancel the first one, and we can send it to another address where you might be relocated to. That's probably one of the biggest takeaways here today.
And how long should you wait? I mean, if you don't get that vote by mail ballot, when should you start calling your supervisor of elections office to say, hey, I need a replacement ballot, or I need that vote by mail ballot?
You can actually track that ballot and see, when you're supposed to be getting it. And if you haven't gotten one by now, you should definitely be calling our office. One other little tip is that a Hillsborough County voter today can come into any of our 5 offices that are open, and they can get what's called an over-the-counter vote by mail ballot. Mm-hmm. So they come in, they have to show identification, fill out a form, and we will produce their specific ballot form right there. They can vote it. They can deposit it in one of our secure ballot intake stations at those offices. So, I would just encourage people to, take advantage of those opportunities of either getting that vote by mail ballot sent to another mailing address, or come into our offices and you can vote an over-the-counter ballot. Now, Monday, the 21st, we will have 27 early vote sites open around the county. So, there will be ample opportunity for people to take advantage of that. And I would encourage them to take advantage that first week. Don't wait.
Speaking of early voting, where can they do that in Hillsborough County?
So we have 27 sites. I would encourage them to go to my website, votehillsborough.gov, and you can click on the link for early voting, and it'll tell you where all those sites are.
Were any of the sites impacted by Hurricanes Helene and Milton, or 27 was what you were going to have, storm or no storm?
Yeah, we do have one that was impacted. We're in the process right now of relocating that. We don't have a firm yes where it's going to be, but it's going to be in the same area as that other early vote site was.
I know you work pretty closely with your colleagues around the Tampa Bay region in terms of supervisors of elections. So where can folks in other counties find out what to do in terms of where those early vote sites might be or impacts from the storm?
Same thing. Go on your supervisor of elections website. It's Pinellas Votes, Pasco Votes, Sarasota Votes, I think. But whatever your county is, go on that website. They should have information on there of where the early vote sites are. They're also, I know, several of us are running a page on there that's, effects of the hurricane, and it's kind of a running list of different changes that are taking place. But if all else fails, pick the phone up and call the office and talk to a person in your county.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you expect elections officers to have to find additional workers? Perhaps some people have had to focus on rebuilding at home, and was that already a change that you were facing?
Yeah, and that actually happened after Helene. And the governor issued an executive order that basically says that under the way it was previously, to work the polls, you had to be a registered voter in your county. And they've lifted that now. So actually other counties can send people in. They also are encouraging state workers to work the polls too. So, you may get a state worker that lives in Hillsborough County or works in Hillsborough County, but lives someplace else and maybe wants to work in Pinellas County. So there's a lot of latitude there to work with.
Now, speaking of some accommodations made in the aftermath of these two severe storms, the governor was asked by some voting rights groups to extend the voter registration deadline. He didn't extend that deadline, but he did make some accommodations around early voting sites and mail-in ballot requests. Can you just remind us what those accommodations are and what they mean for voters?
Yeah, one of the biggest ones is around the mailing address, where we're able to utilize your personal information, your driver's license number, the last 4 years social, to verify who you are, and then we can redirect that vote by mail ballot to an address that we didn't originally have on file with you. You might have gotten flooded out of your house in Helene, and you're staying with relatives in another county or another state. And give us that availability. That's probably the biggest one. Also, there was a little change around drop boxes or secure ballot intake stations. The way the statute reads is if a site qualified to be an early vote site, which would be most government buildings, then you could also have a secure ballot intake station at that site. And that will be helpful for some of the coastal counties that may have lost those sites along the beaches there.
Mm-hmm. And as far as Hillsborough County goes, it sounds like you only really had one site that you were going to have to think about relocating.
Right, and we're in the process right now of assessing our 240 election day sites also. Mm-hmm. And with that are over 2,500 poll workers to make sure that they have availability still, and they're not, as you said earlier, they've not been flooded out and had to leave and go to another area of the state. So we're in the process of doing that now. We do know that we've got several of our election day sites that are not going to be available, and we'll be able to co-locate those sites to a nearby site. Mm-hmm. So that's another latitude that we have there, because you're not supposed to make changes within 30 days of an election, but we're going to have to.
One other accommodation I think that I noted is if a ballot is to be mailed to an address other than the one on file, the written request had to be signed, but that requirement, as I understand, is waived in this case. Is that what's happened?
That is correct. You explained that perfectly. Yeah, previously it would have required a written signed request to us. Now we're able to do it by verifying your driver's license number or the last 4 years social. Mm-hmm. Keep in mind too that when those come back, you have to sign the oath on the back, and we're verifying the signature, comparing it against the signature we have on file in our office.
Hurricane season isn't over too. I mean, what's the contingency plan if a hurricane were to hit on or close to Election Day?
Yeah, well, ultimately the state has some authority there too, but elections are going to go on, and that's why we're encouraging people to vote early. Don't wait till Election Day, because you're right. There might be another storm whipping up out there, So we just want to encourage people to, either take advantage of early voting, come into our office, get an over-the-counter ballot, or get a vote by mail ballot and get that ballot in so that your voice is heard.
Craig, this is already a very closely watched election in terms of verifying votes. How do these two back-to-back storms add to the level of scrutiny that is going to be on this election in the aftermath of that?
I don't think that that's really going to impact it. I can take you back through the years. We had, was it Hurricane Michael hit up in the Panhandle about the same time, as a matter of fact, and devastated some counties up there. Again, the governor stepped in with an executive order to make things a little bit easier for people to cast a ballot. The thing to remember, though, is that we may be making it a little bit easier for somebody to cast a ballot, but there's still safety and security there. People still have to show identification. You've got to furnish driver's license numbers, last four socials, stuff that we can match in our files. So voting is going to go on. They're not going to cancel the election on November 5th.
And that's an important message to leave voters with, right? This is still happening. It's still very important. You still have ample ways to exercise your civic rights there. Craig Latimer, Supervisor of Elections for Hillsborough County, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
You can find more insights on the 2024 presidential election by downloading the Our Changing State Vote 2024 podcast and watch it on YouTube. Up next on Florida Matters, as communities rebuild from Hurricane Milton, you're going to hear how adaptation and resilient design can make a difference in preparing for future storms. You're listening to Florida Matters. I'm Matthew Petty. While we're just days out from Hurricane Milton, it's important to think about how we can make our communities more resilient. That's an important part of the recovery, according to John Rennie. He's an urban and environmental solutions professor at Florida Atlantic University, and his job is to look at long-term solutions to disasters. You'll hear Rennie explain how resiliency can be part of the rebuilding process and lessons learned from Hurricane Katrina, which devastated New Orleans 19 years ago.
My heart goes out, because it's the beginning of a long process. But this whole thing, we got to look at, how do we prepare for storms? How do we respond to storms, right? And evacuation is part of the respond to storms. But then after, in the aftermath, which is where we are now, right? We're in the immediate recovery phase, which is, getting people's lives back to normal. And that takes a long time. And then there's the long-term recovery stage, which we also need to start thinking about right now is, how do we design our cities to be more resilient?
So, to your point, John, right after a devastating hurricane like Milton or Helene, the focus is on getting things running again. So you're looking at power, water, fixing roads and sewers and repairing damage. Where does resiliency or adaptation come into rebuilding a community that's been hit by a storm like this?
Well, resiliency is something we need to really start thinking about every day. But of course, it's always in the aftermath of a major disaster where we start talking about it and having debates about it, in public discourse, which is a good thing. We are threatened by sea level rise, intense hurricanes with large storm surge. And the thing about both storm surge and sea level rise is that, whether we have a Cat 3, Cat 4, Cat 5 hurricane and it brings a huge storm surge of water in, or whether we're being affected by king tides due to sea level rise, which is also what we're seeing happening going on in coastal Florida as well. The areas that are impacted are the same places. So we need to start to develop plans for these areas that look at housing and infrastructure. It needs to look at elevation and streets. And the good news is that we can do something about it. The bad news is that it's going to change our lives, and it is changing our lives. And what that means is that, there are eventually going to be some places that may not be inhabitable in the long term. And then there's going to be places that we can protect with infrastructure, right? And so we need to kind of figure out the differences in the long run between the places that we can preserve and ultimately the places that may not be affordable to preserve in the long run.
Now, you've also done a lot of research and you've focused a lot of your writing on things that kind of happen incrementally, right? And you mentioned some of that at the start of the conversation about king tide flooding in South Florida. So in those cases, you do see communities doing things incrementally, like building up roads, making stormwater infrastructure more resilient. Are those some things that communities in Tampa Bay are thinking about or need to be thinking about to try and bit by bit make this area more resilient to, 1 in 100-year hurricanes when they come along?
Yes. So the conversation about adapting our communities is really kind of the focus of the book that I published recently with Billy Fields called Adaptation Urbanism. There's a movement underway in Florida and nationally and globally to basically create safe streets and complete streets. And a complete street is one where people can drive, but they can also bike safely. They can walk across the street safely. And they can take the bus if they take public transit. And so, as we are thinking about the day-to-day needs of moving traffic and creating safer streets, what our book is saying is, listen, let's also think about adapting the streets for climate change and creating, for example, a bioswale. A bioswale is a landscaping technique, right, that creates like a linear landscaping area next to the sidewalk. Let's call it between the sidewalk and maybe the curb, right? Which is a bit of a divot. And in that divot, you can plant trees, you can put bushes, flowers, shrubs, whatever. But what it does is when it rains heavily, it absorbs the water, and the water goes to the bioswale areas and then funnels down to where the detention needs to be, as opposed to putting all in storm sewer.
Right. So you're kind of saying, let's not look at streets as just a way to move cars primarily and then people and other forms of transportation. You're also saying you can use them as ways to kind of move water around if necessary. I mean, one of the things that struck me as interesting about your book is you look at Rotterdam and how that's become a city which has really sort of built some of these adaptive features into its kind of streetscape architecture, right? Is that something you could see happening in Florida, like in some communities in Tampa Bay?
Absolutely. And Rotterdam's a great example because in Rotterdam, they suffered very heavily from bombing in World War II. And so they lost most of their historic architecture that most people would think of, as kind of the classical European medieval city. So Rotterdam was built pretty much during the same era as most American cities were built. And they followed the same sort of patterns that American cities built with, kind of busy, wide streets, which ultimately led to a lot of traffic. The difference is that Rotterdam, about 30 years ago, started to really focus on retrofitting their city to make the streets safer and to manage water more effectively. Because remember, the Netherlands is very similar to Florida in that it's a very low-lying place that experiences a lot of flooding. And so I think Rotterdam is a fantastic place for us to look at to see like what they have done well and how to emulate that for places in Tampa and across South Florida. And I've been to Rotterdam when we were writing that case study, and I was really blown away at what a livable, enjoyable city it was.
One of the other things, too, that's important to note about Rotterdam, John, is that it also has this massive piece of engineering, and it's essentially this gigantic storm surge barrier, right? I think one of the biggest moving kind of engineering structures in the world, if I'm not mistaken. So is that kind of thing realistic? I mean, could that be a way for Tampa Bay or some communities to kind of engineer the threat level down when you're thinking about storm surge and the risk posed by these big, powerful hurricanes?
I think it's certainly worth looking into. I'm not, a coastal engineer, so I can't tell you, if a Rotterdam-style flood protection would work in the Tampa Bay area or not. But what I can tell you is that, like, if it would work, right? If the engineers say, yes, this could work, then if you think about the amount of value in real estate that it could protect, it's certainly worth taking a look at because, even if, for example, let's just say a structure like this might cost several $billions, which is a huge price tag. If you look at the value of the real estate that it could potentially protect and save, it may be a cost a positive cost benefit to make that investment in the long run. But again, whether it works or not, I would have to consult with an engineer to see if it actually would work or not.
Thinking about Hurricane Katrina, which you've written extensively about, I mean, what are some of the big takeaways from that recovery that can be applied to Hurricane Milton and Tampa Bay area specifically?
It's a great question. You know, we're coming up to the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina next year, and I started thinking about that. Like, what are the lessons? And so, one of the things that I would say is a key lesson, and having lived there during that period for a decade, while I had moved there 2 weeks before the storm, and I lived there until the end of 2015. I would say one of the big lessons is the grassroots nonprofit organization's role in the recovery is so important, right? The issues that we're talking about cannot be imposed from the top down. This is not the federal government telling us what to do. It's not the state government telling us what to do. And honestly, it's not the government officials saying this is what has to happen. This has to be a collective effort that really, it starts at the grassroots level. Now, you may say, how do we start this at the grassroots level? You know, how does a neighborhood organization or a homeowner or a, some nonprofit organization that's involved in these issues get involved? And I tell you, that can take some time. It takes some years to organize. But what happens after these storms is people get motivated and they see what's happening, they see the devastation, and they want to be involved. And so one of the best things that the local governments can do is to create a process, an opportunity to engage these local organizations, because the expertise and the knowledge is out there, and a lot of local people know how to protect their communities. Of course, you're never going to get consensus on whether or not, for example, a neighborhood should be abandoned or not, right? Those sometimes are difficult decisions that have to be made, but the conversation needs to be an ongoing conversation. I'd say that's the biggest lesson from Katrina.
Well, John Rennie, Professor and Director of the Center for Urban and Environmental Solutions at Florida Atlantic University, thank you so much for your insights. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate the time.
That's Florida Matters for this week. The show's executive producer is Grayson Doctor. Engineering support from Jackson Harp, Blake Bass, and Dave Anderson. Subscribe to Florida Matters wherever you get your podcasts. Find more on WUSF.org. There you can also get the latest updates on the recovery from Hurricane Milton. I'm Matthew Petty. Thank you for listening.